In the heat of an argument, Nero kicked his pregnant wife in the stomach. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, Empress of Rome, worshipped as a goddess, and was carrying his heir. They had argued. She mocked his obsession with performing on stage. He responded with violence. One blow, maybe more. She collapsed onto the marble floor, gasping, bleeding, silent. Nero begged his physicians to save her, but it was too late. She was gone, and so was the child. Most men would have grieved. Nero did something else. Before we continue, if you like more untold histories like this one, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We appreciate every contribution in our journey through history. Nero searched the palace and found a 15-year-old boy named Sporus, a former slave, quiet, delicate features. He looked, just barely, like Poppaea. That was all Nero needed. He had Sporus castrated, dressed him in Poppaea's gowns, taught him to walk, speak, and smile like she once had, then married him in a full imperial wedding and gave him her wife's name, Sabina. This is not just a story about ancient Rome. It is a story about power without limits, about grief that turned into obsession, and about a boy who was forced to become a mirror of a dead empress. Nero was not always a monster. When he first became emperor in the year 54 AD, Rome was hopeful. He was only 16 years old. Young, charismatic, and guided by capable advisors, he lowered taxes, banned secret trials, and funded entertainment for the people. Many believed he would usher in a golden age. At first, he avoided violence. He even refused to sign execution orders, claiming he wanted nothing to do with bloodshed. But that changed, slowly then suddenly. As Nero grew older, the pressures of power began to twist him. His mother, Agrippina, who had helped him reach the throne, became overbearing. She wanted to control him. Eventually, he had her killed. First by collapsing her ship. When she survived, he sent assassins to finish the job. From that moment on, something in Nero shifted. His violence became personal. He grew paranoid. Surrounded by flatterers and yes-men, he began to see enemies everywhere. Senators, generals, even poets, all were potential threats. And so, one by one, he eliminated them. At the same time, Nero began to see himself not just as an emperor, but as an artist. He performed in public theater. He played the lyre and sang on stage for hours at a time. He believed himself to be a genius, a gift to Rome, not just as a ruler, but as a cultural icon. Criticizing him, even lightly, became dangerous. This is where Poppaea Sabina enters the story. She was not just beautiful. She was intelligent, ambitious, and skilled at navigating Roman court politics. When Nero met her, he was still married to his first wife, Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. Octavia was quiet and modest. Poppaea was not. She drew attention, and she enjoyed it. Their affair began in secret. Then it became public. Nero divorced Octavia and married Poppaea in a grand imperial wedding. When the Roman public objected to how he had treated Octavia, Nero had her exiled and later executed. With Poppaea by his side, Nero seemed deeply attached, obsessed even. He gave her gifts from across the empire, pearls from India, silks from China, perfumes from Arabia. He ordered statues and portraits of her, not only for public spaces but for his private chambers. He wanted to be surrounded by her image at all times. But this obsession was not love. It was control. Nero isolated her from others. He placed guards around her, claiming it was for her protection. In reality, they were watching her. Every interaction, every conversation was monitored. And then there were the arguments. Poppaea was one of the few people who dared speak honestly to him. She criticized his decisions. She mocked his performances. She told him that being an emperor meant more than playing instruments and acting on stage. It was during one of these arguments, possibly after Nero returned late from the chariot races, that things spiraled out of control. Poppaea was pregnant at the time. Nero lost his temper and kicked her. According to multiple ancient sources, the blow caused fatal internal injuries. Whether it was one strike or several is not known for certain, But the result is she died, and so did the unborn child. For the first time, Nero faced a loss he could not undo. And he did not handle it like a grieving husband. He handled it like a man who believed the world should obey his will. After Poppaea's death, Nero refused to move on. He did not allow her body to be cremated, as Roman custom required. Instead, he had it embalmed and placed in an elaborate tomb. He declared her a goddess. He established a cult in her honor. He held conversations with her corpse, speaking aloud in his private chambers as if she could hear him. At court, everyone was expected to pretend that she was still present. Her seat was kept empty at banquets. Servants referred to her in the present tense. Anyone who suggested Nero should remarry, or even consider grieving in a normal way, was punished, exiled, or executed. It was during this period, sometime in late 66 or early 67 AD, that Nero noticed Sporus, a teenage boy, probably around 15 years old. He had been born into slavery within the imperial household, but had been freed while still young. That gave him a special status in Rome, a freedman with access to the court. He was educated, likely trained for administrative duties, and may have even handled small matters for Nero's staff. But what made him stand out had nothing to do with his intelligence. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources, including Suetonius and Cassius Dio, mention that Sporus bore a striking resemblance to the dead Empress Poppaea, especially around the eyes and the shape of his jaw. For most people, that resemblance would have been a curiosity. But for Nero, it was something else entirely. He saw in Sporus the possibility of reversing time, of undoing what he had done, of bringing back the woman he had killed, even if only in appearance. Of course, there was one problem. Sporus was male, but Nero did not see that as an obstacle. This was a man who had already killed his mother, who had executed his first wife, who had forced Rome to applaud his acting on stage for hours at a time, reality bent around his desires. And now he wanted Poppaea back. So he made a decision. He would not simply dress Sporus like her. He would turn him into her. What happened next was not symbolic. It was physical. It was surgical. Nero ordered his physicians to make Sporus more like Poppaea, not in clothing or speech, but in body. This meant castration. In the Roman world, castration was sometimes performed on slaves or foreign captives, but what Nero ordered went beyond that. It was not just about removing Sporus' ability to reproduce. It was about reshaping him into a living replacement for the woman he had killed. The procedure took place inside the palace, in specially prepared quarters. There was no modern anesthesia, no sterile instruments. The tools were bronze. The pain was unimaginable. Sporus would have been held down by guards. The physicians would have worked with speed, but the surgery was dangerous. The risk of death from blood loss or infection was high. Many did not survive this kind of procedure. But Sporus did survive. When he regained consciousness, his life as he had known it was over. He would never father children. He would never again be seen as fully male in Roman society. He had been physically altered to serve a role he did not choose. And that was only the beginning. Nero gave him a new name, Sabina. It was Poppaea's family name. Then he moved Sporus into new chambers, decorated to resemble Poppaea's old rooms. Every detail was intentional. The furniture, the colors, even the scent of the oils burned in the lamps. The goal was not just imitation, it was replacement. Sporus was given servants to dress him, instruct him, and supervise his transformation. Tailors created gowns designed to flatter his new body and conceal any remaining masculine features. Jewelry was brought out, much of it once owned by Poppaea herself. Necklaces, earrings, and rings were assigned to him. Makeup artists trained him in Roman cosmetics. They taught him how to apply powder to soften his features, how to use kohl to darken the eyes, how to mimic the faint flush of Poppaea's cheeks. Hairdressers curled and arranged his hair using heated iron rods. They taught him how to sit still for hours while elaborate styles were constructed on his head, styles worn by noble Roman women. He was also given lessons in behavior. He was taught how to walk with short, elegant steps, how to position his hands when speaking, how to tilt his head in a feminine manner, how to avoid gestures that look too masculine. Even his voice was retrained. Tutors instructed him to speak in a higher register, to avoid harsh or forceful tones, and to adopt speech patterns associated with aristocratic Roman women. None of this was optional. He was no longer seen as a boy. He was expected to behave like a widow, not just any widow, Poppaea's widow, and in Nero's mind, she had returned. In the spring of 67 AD, Nero married Sporus. This was not a private arrangement. It was a full imperial ceremony, witnessed by Roman elites, carried out with priests, oaths, legal contracts, and a public banquet. The hall was decorated with imported flowers. Thousands of oil lamps lit the marble columns. Musicians played wedding songs. Slaves poured wine into gold cups. Everything followed tradition except the bride. Sporus stood in the role of Poppaea. He wore a bridal gown designed for a Roman empress. His hair was styled in a formal imperial pattern. His face was powdered and painted. Around his neck hung a necklace that had once belonged to the real Poppaea, and beside him stood Nero, dressed in ceremonial robes, smiling, pleased. Together, they exchanged vows. Together, they signed the documents. Together, they were declared husband and wife under Roman law. Many of the guests knew exactly what they were witnessing. Some whispered in horror, others watched in silence, but no one objected. In Nero's Rome, speaking out meant exile or worse. After the wedding, Nero treated Sporus as his legitimate spouse. He was assigned a full household staff. He had his own quarters inside the palace. He received an allowance from the imperial treasury. He was given a litter, a ceremonial vehicle for travel, and a personal escort. He even rode in public beside Nero during state events, seated like an empress. In every public appearance, Sporus was expected to smile, speak gently, and behave as if nothing were strange, as if he had always been a woman, as if he had always been the Empress of Rome. But behind the performances, the truth was simple. He was not Poppaea. He had never been Poppaea. But he was forced to become her because Nero could not live with what he had done. This was not affection. This was not desire. It was something colder. The attempt to bring the dead back to life by destroying the living. And it worked, for a time. Every day that followed the wedding was a performance. Sporus was no longer allowed to act like himself. If he ever had been, every gesture, every word, every moment of silence had to match what Nero imagined Poppaea would have done. At state banquets, Sporus sat beside Nero, dressed in layers of silk and gold. He was expected to raise his cup at the right moments, to smile when Nero told stories, to laugh softly when Nero sang. And when Nero spoke about memories he had shared with the real Poppaea, memories Sporus had never lived, he was expected to nod, as if he remembered too. This was not just about appearance, it was about obedience. Nero believed the illusion he had created. He had not simply replaced a wife, he had replaced reality. For Sporus, the consequences were suffocating. Each morning he woke in a bedroom decorated to match Poppaea's. The same curtains, the same fragrance, the same colors. Mirrors surrounded him. Servants waited to prepare him for the day. They dressed him, styled him, pinned jewelry onto his body. All of it in silence. Every mirror reflected back a version of someone else. There was no room for grief, no space for anger, no recognition of who he had once been, only the mask of Sabina. And Sporus wore it well. Ancient writers say he learned quickly. He became skilled at anticipating Nero's moods, smiling when expected, looking down when needed, avoiding even the smallest mistake. Because one mistake could be fatal, Nero had already killed the woman he claimed to love most. Sporus knew what could happen if he failed to meet expectations. So he became perfect. Polite, obedient, feminine, silent. But beneath the silence, he was disappearing. Not just socially, not just legally. He was being erased, one day at a time. And then, without warning, the world outside the palace began to collapse. Rebellion spread, the army turned, and the emperor who believed he could shape reality began to lose control. But even as Rome rejected him, Nero still kept Sporus by his side. The performance was not over, it was only entering its final act. By the year 68 AD, Nero's control over the Roman Empire was falling apart. His obsession with performance had become a national embarrassment. While Rome burned, Nero sang. While governors begged for troops, he organized poetry contests. He spent huge sums of money on games, statues, and personal luxuries. The empire's finances collapsed. His paranoia deepened. He ordered the executions of senators, nobles, and even generals. And the empire began to turn against him. Revolts broke out in Gaul, then in Hispania. Governors declared open rebellion, the Senate debated removing him, and most importantly, the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor, withdrew their loyalty. They no longer believed he could hold power. Nero panicked. He fled the city with only a small group of loyal followers. One of them was Sporus. Even in exile, Nero refused to let him go. The boy, now dressed daily in the image of a dead woman, was forced to stay close. As Nero planned escape routes and imagined comebacks, Sporus remained by his side, silent and obedient. Still wearing Poppaea's jewelry, still called by her name, they hid in a villa outside Rome, waiting for word. But no rescue came. On June 9, 68 AD, Nero learned that the Senate had declared him a public enemy. Execution was inevitable. Roman law allowed a condemned man to take his own life instead, and Nero chose that path. He could not do it himself. He begged one of his companions to help. As the soldiers approached, Nero drove a dagger into his throat. It was a clumsy wound. He died slowly. Moaning, his final words were, "What an artist dies in me." With Nero dead, the empire moved on. But Sporus was not free. He was now a problem, and a prize. After Nero's death, Sporus became vulnerable in a new way. He was no longer protected by the emperor, but he was also no longer anonymous. Everyone in Rome knew who he was, or rather, who he had been made to be. He had stood at Nero's side as a wife. He had been paraded through public ceremonies. He had worn the name Sabina. Now he was a political symbol, a reminder of Nero's madness, and whoever held power next would have to decide what to do with him. That decision did not go well for Sporus. He was taken in by a Roman officer named Nymphidius Sabinus, who had briefly seized control of the Praetorian Guard. Sabinus treated Sporus as Nero had, dressing him in women's clothing, calling him Poppaea, and displaying him as part of his household. But Sabinus was soon killed. Power changed hands again. Next, Sporus was passed to Otho, a short-lived emperor who had once been married to Poppaea himself, before she left him for Nero. The irony was painful. Otho kept Sporus close, but not for long. Within months, he was dead too. Finally, Sporus ended up in the hands of Vitellius, the next emperor in the chaotic year of the four emperors. And that is where the horror reached its final stage. Vitellius did not want Sporus as a companion. He wanted him as entertainment. He ordered that Sporus be forced to appear in the Roman arena, the Colosseum, during a public festival. The plan was to stage a performance based on Greek mythology. Sporus would play a female character, likely a rape victim or tragic bride, and be publicly humiliated in front of thousands of spectators. This was not a rumor. It was an official event being planned by the imperial court. For Sporus, it was the final insult. He had survived surgery. He had survived years of psychological control. He had played a role he never chose, and now he was being offered up as a spectacle, not to be remembered, but to be laughed at. He refused. Before the day of the performance, Sporus found poison. He took it and died. He was probably no older than 20 years old. Sporus died the only way he could truly choose, in silence and on his own terms. He was never given a trial, never given a voice, never allowed to grow up as himself. From the moment Nero saw his face and decided it looked like hers, his fate was sealed. He stopped being a person. He became a project, a ghost, a symbol of grief twisted into obsession. Ancient writers Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and others recorded Sporus' story, but not with sympathy. They used him as an example of Nero's decadence, a curiosity, a footnote in the decline of the empire. Almost none of them ask what he might have wanted, what dreams he gave up, what pain he endured, what he thought about in the quiet moments when no one was watching. But that silence is part of the tragedy. Because Sporus was not just a reflection of Nero's madness, he was a victim of a world where power had no limits, and identity could be reshaped, erased, or sold to serve the desires of the emperor. His death was a final act of resistance. He refused to be paraded again. He refused to play a role one more time for a crowd that did not care who he really was. He took the only freedom left to him, and for that alone, he deserves to be remembered, not as Poppaea, not as Sabina, and not as Nero's living doll, but as Sporus, a boy who tried to survive in a world that refused to see him.